we'll come back to you, Aidan, if that's okay. And we might just move on, and we might come back and ask Aidan if we have a little bit of time to share or to have a look at Aidan's video that he was showing. But we did get quite a lot from Aidan, and one of the first things that has struck me was one of the simplest forms of activism was to be sure to buy fair trade. And also really what he had to say was about empowerment. So there was a lot that he had put into what he had said, and we're very, very grateful for the preparation and all that he has shared with us this evening. And we may well come back to Aidan at this time. So we're very, very grateful to Aidan for that. And please God, we get a few minutes to come back. We have checked in the chat box, and as yet he must have done quite a good job because there are no questions there as yet. But that's not to say that you can't pose any in the meantime as thoughts strike you. So maybe we might just move on straight away if that's okay. And I might ask if Sister Mary DeLargy might introduce Dr. Ciara Walsh from the Jesuit Centre for Faith and Justice. Sister Mary, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brian. So it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Ciara Murphy to present at this webinar. Ciara is the Environmental Policy Advocate at the Jesuit Centre for Faith and Justice. And Ciara is going to speak to us on Pope Francis' second exhortation, Laudate Deum. So Ciara, you have the floor and you're very welcome. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for inviting me to this brilliant webinar. And it's great to hear that so many people have attended. So I am obviously, I am with the Jesuit Centre for Faith and Justice as their environmental policy advocate. But my background is actually in environmental biology. So a lot of these things have kind of come to me as I've been in the position. But I'm here to talk to you today on Laudate Deum, which was published in early October this year. So it was 8 years after the publication of Laudate Si, which I'm sure a lot of people on this call will be familiar with. It was on caring for a common home, and it covered a wide range of environmental issues, from water to biodiversity, climate change, health, and it really kind of cemented the social degradation and the environmental degradation were two sides of the same coin. So Laudate Deum is I suppose a sequel or I suppose it's a confirmation and a continuation of Laudate Si. So it's a very explicit and urgent communication specifically around climate change, and it's addressed to all people of good faith. And in this exhortation, he challenges, I suppose, the lack of urgency and the denial and the lack of political action. And if any of you have had a chance to read it, you'll see that I suppose the anger is palpable. It's a very, very strong and striking. It's a very strong piece, and I'd recommend everyone to read it actually, because it's a very, very it's just a very good read as well. So this webinar is focusing on consumerism and its adverse impacts on communities in the African continent. So for some people, the link between consumerism and climate change is slightly tenuous, but for Pope Francis, the link is incredibly clear. So Aidan has covered really beautifully the relationship between consumerism and Christmas. It's the time of year that we buy a lot of stuff, and it might necessarily be stuff that we need or stuff that we have consciously consumed. It's there's a lot of, I suppose, pressure to just buy at this time of year. So kind of relating that into this piece is we know that all production has some environmental impact. So let's just say the production of clothes, electronic devices, even food, all come from raw materials which must be grown. It's mined in some way or extracted from the earth in some way. We then use an awful lot of energy to process all of these things, usually producing carbon dioxide, producing other forms of pollution and byproducts which need to be managed. So let's just take this, the computer that I'm using to talk to you. today has hundreds of different components. Some of them, a lot of them needed to be mined. All of them needed to be processed in very specific ways. All the components needed to be put together in a factory. It was shipped. I bought it. It was in packaging, and now I'm using energy to not only run this machine and to power the computer to talk to you, but also all of the kind of background energy used in like over Zoom, over the kind of cloud computing, kind of the energy that's consumed in the storage and the running of the internet. So all of these things, when we produce or when we consume a product, is not just the energy and the resources that go into making the product. It's to go into the transport, the production, the mining, and the use of the products as well. So consumption, as we know, is intrinsically linked with increasing emissions and climate change. We have not broken the kind of link between consumption and emissions. And the energy that it takes to produce items and ship them, and the energy it takes to use them and dispose of them when we're finished, it all adds up. So all of these things that we're using and consuming all adds up. So the entire chain of production to consumption has an environmental impact. And as Pope Francis points out, this production is not equal. It is not it's not equal among everyone in every different country. So if we consider, I quote Pope Francis, if we consider that emissions per individual in the United States are about 2 times greater than those of individuals living in China, and about 7 times greater than the average of the poorest country, we can state that a broad change in irresponsible lifestyle connected to the Western model would have a significant long-term impact. As a result, along with the indispensable political decisions, we would be making progress along the way to genuine care for one another. So here he's very explicit that it is our high consumption lifestyle that is having an impact, and changing this lifestyle will be incredibly important to care for our common home. So the emissions associated with the production and consumption of the stuff we buy at Christmas and all throughout the year doesn't stay within our country boundaries. They disperse across the entire globe, playing havoc with the climate, with climatic systems. So changes in rainfall pattern causing prolonged drought in some areas, severe flooding in others, rising sea levels, increased erosion, violent storms, and dangerous heat waves are all happening, and we've all actually experienced them either through the news or in our own countries this year. They're all happening at various levels and in every country across the globe, but no country will not feel the impact of climate change, but some will feel it a lot more than others. And by now, I'm sure a lot of you have kind of heard some variation of the fact that those who contribute least to climate change will bear the brunt of its impact. And in Laudate Deum, Pope Francis reminds us that how can we forget that Africa, home to more than half the world's poorest people, is responsible for a minimal portion of historic emissions. So this isn't just a climate change issue. This is a climate justice issue. It's an equality issue, and it's a topic that's kind of very clearly understood. And the IPCC has done a lot of research in this, and it also states in a recent publication that Africa is one of the lowest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions causing climate change, yet key development sectors have already experienced widespread losses and damages attributable to climate-induced or human-induced climate change, including biodiversity loss, water shortages, and reduced food production, and the loss of lives and reduced economic growth. So the combination, so in African countries, the combination of being particularly impacted, I suppose, by climate change, and we see this both with the devastating drought in the Horn of Africa and the increased desertification in the Sahel, which are impacts of climate change. as well as the lack of economic buffer to kind of help adapt to and deal with these impacts, makes the region particularly vulnerable to climate change. So this webinar is incredibly timely. So you may be aware that COP28 is currently in process in the United Arab Emirates. And again, this is something that Pope Francis, he featured strongly COP28 in the Laudate Deum. So while some might be disillusioned with the COP28 or the COP process, and COP28 in particular, for Pope Francis, he holds a lot of hope that this process can and does deliver. So I'm going to quote again. So if we are confident in the capacity of human beings to transcend their petty interests and to think in bigger terms, we can keep hoping that COP28 will allow for a decisive acceleration in energy transition. The conference can represent a change in direction, showing that everything done since 2002 or 1992 was in fact serious and worth the effort, or else it would be a great disappointment and jeopardize whatever good has been achieved thus far. So he's incredibly clear that the international politics and that the most effective solutions will come from political decisions at national and international level, as well as people who hold the most powerful, I suppose, in the world. But he's also adamant that all of us hold responsibility to act. So he asks us all to accompany in the pilgrimage of reconciliation with the world, so that it can be more beautiful, so that our commitment to do climate action can be a personal dignity. He also states that every little bit helps, and we know this because every single ton of emissions that are released into the atmosphere produces a worse climate impact. So the more we reduce, even if it is at our individual levels, the more we can alleviate some of the sufferings. But he also states that there's a more subtle change as well. So what is important is something less qualitative. The need to realize that there is no lasting change without cultural changes, without a maturing in lifestyle and convictions within society. And there are no cultural changes without personal changes. So he goes on to say that efforts by households to reduce pollution and waste and to consume with prudence and creating a new culture. So the mere fact that personal, family and community habits are changing is contributing to greater concern about the unfulfilled responsibility of the political sector, and the indignation at the lack of interest shown by the powerful. Let us realize then that even though this does not immediately produce a notable effect from a numbers standpoint, we are helping to bring about a large process of transformation rising from deep within the society. And for me, this is an incredibly important point, because it clarifies how our actions fits within communal and system change. So we can't only act at one scale. We need to take responsibility for our own emissions and our own purchases and consumptions, but it can't just sit there. It needs to be at the scale of fair trade, where you have communities coming together to take actions, and it needs to be at the system change, where we demand that our political leaders take the decisions that are needed to reduce our emissions at a national and international level. So we will never get system change without our national governments agreeing. But personal acts of change not only reduce the amount that we contribute to the problem, but also fortifies our convictions and changes awareness of the issues and creates an alternative kind of culture that people can see. So our individual actions are, I suppose, the foundation that communal and system change can be built on. So I think that's my piece on Laudate. And again, thank you very much for having me at the webinar.
Thank you indeed, Ciara, and you gave us a wonderful description of where it's at and you certainly filled in the context, and you were able to refer to Aidan's wonderful piece at the very beginning. I took a lot from what you said, particularly around the last part when you asked us to reflect on our own actions, which is what the Pope is asking us to do. And you're right, there is a certain amount of anger in it, and the language in it is quite fussy. And it's not an accident that we're holding this particular webinar smack in the middle of COP. But you also mentioned things like the sequel to Laudato Si, and that there's an urgency in it, and that again is addressed to all. It's not just to those of one faith or all faith, but that there is a challenge to us all. And the question is, this Christmas, are we able to rise to that challenge? And the fact too that all production has an environmental component, which is true, but I hadn't thought of it. I was at a particular webinar earlier on this evening, which was produced by Stop Climate Chaos and Trócaire. And something that struck me, which kind of comes from what Aidan has said and what you have said, Ciara, is where they said, look, what we really need now is a fast, fair, feminist funded phase out of fossil fuels. And I thought all them F's and PHs certainly kind of got it in there. But so thank you very much indeed for that, Ciara. And I'm not sure now, I was going to ask Jerry if there are any questions. I'm unsure if there are. Anything there, Jerry?
We have one comment, and it says, thank you, Ciara. I'm especially concerned about the proliferation in Ireland of attractive, cheap clothing containing viscose, which is extremely harmful to producers and their families, as well as harmful to the environment, polluting rivers, etc. And that was from Teresa Osborne. I mean, obviously, that's a thing to avoid. I don't know whether Ciara wants to come back on that.
Yeah, so I think fast fashion of I suppose of any materials is incredibly bad for the environment and for social. Like you cannot create clothes that cheap and be fair. If we take in Aidan's comments at the start, it's just like you literally cannot produce clothes that cheap and have everything kind of right further up. So there's a huge amount of problems in terms of fast fashion, in terms of pollution, paying people under the minimum wage, and the amount of waste. So I agree. I would be also very concerned about fast fashion. Yeah, I don't know a huge amount about viscose in particular. I know that there's the processing that comes with clothes a lot of harmful chemicals do need to be used to produce, especially I think viscose is where you produce the material from, let's just say, beech or kind of a more hard cellulose kind of material. So there's an awful lot of chemicals that are needed. So yeah, I think it's the volume and the value that we place on these clothes that is a huge problem, as well as what's in them.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Ciara. We might